The chill of the northern palace seeped through stone and into bone. Ilara had never known a cold so complete. It was more than the wind that howled down from the Frostfang peaks. It was in the silence of the halls, the averted eyes of the servants, the hollow grief that clung to the king himself. King Theron, the Alpha of Alphas, was a man carved from the mountain's heart, hard, remote, and fractured by a sorrow no one dared name. She was just an Omega, an orphan with nowhere else to go, hired as a scullery maid, and grateful for the meagre warmth of the kitchens. Her world was one of soapsuds and steaming laundry, but whispers were the true currency of the castle. They spoke of the late queen, lost to childbirth a year prior. They spoke of the infant heir, Prince Kael, a child who never felt his father's touch. And they spoke of the king, a ruler whose heart had apparently died with his mate, leaving only a cold shell to govern a kingdom. Ilara, with her quiet nature, was a ghost in these halls, a collector of sad stories she was never meant to hear. Her own secret, the strange intensity of her senses, made the palace a symphony of despair. She could smell the fear on the other maids, the bitterness in the cook's sweat, the deep, aching loneliness that radiated from the king's chambers like a winter frost. Tonight was the feast of the first moon, a mandatory gathering for the court. Ilara was one of several maids tasked with serving wine, her movements swift and silent as she navigated the crush of nobles. They were dressed in furs and velvets, their laughter loud and brittle. In the center of it all, on a throne of dark ironwood, sat King Theron. He was a formidable presence, broad-shouldered and severe, his dark hair brushing his collar, his grey eyes holding a storm that never broke. He drank little, spoke less, and watched the proceedings with an unnerving stillness. Beside him, her crimson gown a slash of colour in the muted hall, was Lady Seraphina. She was an alpha female from a powerful southern house, beautiful and sharp-edged as a shard of ice. Her ambition was a cloying perfume in the air, a scent Ilara found sickening. It was widely known that the King's Council, led by the shrewd Lord Valerius, was pushing for the match. A new queen, a new start. The prince was brought into the hall, as was tradition. He was held by a stern-faced nurse, a bundle of white linen and quiet fragility. He was a beautiful baby, with a tuft of his father's dark hair, but his eyes were wide and listless. There was a hush as he was presented. This was the heir, the future of the kingdom, the son the king would not acknowledge. The silence stretched. King Theron's jaw tightened, a muscle feathering along the hard line. He did not look at the child. He looked through him as if he were a ghost. The air grew thick with unspoken pity and judgment. Then the baby began to cry. It was not a robust, healthy wail, but a thin, reedy sound of distress that cut through the hall. It was a sound of profound loneliness. The nurse tried to soothe him, rocking him stiffly, but the crying only intensified. King Theron flinched. It was a small movement, a bare twitch of his shoulders, but in his statuesque composure it was like a crack appearing in a glacier. A look of raw, visceral pain crossed his face, there and gone in an instant, replaced by his iron mask. "Such a weakling," Lady Seraphina murmured, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. Her voice was laced with disdain. An heir should have the lungs of a wolf, not a field mouse. The cruelty of the remark was a physical blow. Ilara, refilling a goblet nearby, froze. Her gaze snapped from the crying child to the king. She saw past the crown, past the power. She saw a man drowning. The scent of his agony was overwhelming, a smell like ozone and unshed tears. It was a scent of helpless failure. Without thinking, without any sense of self-preservation, she took a step forward. She didn't speak. She didn't offer a comforting word. Her station forbade it, but she met his gaze across the crowded room. Her own eyes, the plain brown of an omega, held no judgment, only a quiet, startling empathy. It was a simple, human acknowledgment of his pain. For a heartbeat, the world fell away. There was only the broken king and the low-born maid. Theron's stormy grey eyes locked onto hers. He saw no pity, no fear, no ambition. He saw only a reflection of his own desperate sorrow, held in the unwavering gaze of a complete stranger. It was a shock to his system, a jolt to a heart he thought long dead. Who was this girl? He had never seen her before, yet in that moment she saw more of him than anyone. The moment shattered. The nurse, flustered, rushed the wailing prince from the hall. The chatter of the court resumed, a clumsy attempt to stitch the torn fabric of the evening back together. But Theron did not look away from Ilara. He watched her as she retreated back into the shadows, her movements once again demure and servile. But it was too late. He had seen her, and he would not forget. The summons came the next morning. A royal guard, his face impassive, stood at the door to the servants' quarters. "The king requires Ilara of the kitchens." The other maids gasped, their eyes wide with fear and speculation. Bryn, the kind, aging servant who had taken Ilara under her wing, squeezed her hand. "Be careful, child," she whispered, her own scent sharp with worry. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs as she followed the guard through the winding stone corridors. She was taken not to the throne room, but to the king's private solar. It was a stark, masculine space, dominated by a large oak desk and shelves filled with leather-bound tomes. A fire crackled in the hearth, but it did little to warm the room. King Theron stood by the window, staring out at the snow-dusted courtyard. He did not turn when she entered. "You are the maid from the feast," he said. His voice was a low rumble, deeper than she had expected. It vibrated in the air. "Yes, Your Majesty." Her own voice was a trembling whisper. He turned then, and his full attention was a crushing weight. His eyes were even more intense up close, swirling with shades of grey like a winter sky. "Why did you look at me that way?" he demanded. It was not a question, it was an accusation. Ilara swallowed. Honesty was all she had. "I saw your pain, Your Majesty." A flicker of something, surprise, anger, crossed his face. "You saw nothing?" "I did," she insisted softly. "It is a terrible thing to be surrounded by people and feel utterly alone." She spoke from her own experience as an orphan, a perpetual outsider. He stared at her, his expression unreadable. He was used to flattery, to fear, to scheming. This quiet, unnerving sincerity was a language he had forgotten. He had summoned her to dismiss her, to banish the girl whose brief glance had unsettled him more than any assassin's blade. But now he was not so sure. He felt a strange, inexplicable pull toward her, an instinct he couldn't name. Lord Valerius entered the solar without knocking. He was a tall, slender man with silvering hair and eyes the colour of faded parchment. His smile was a practised, pleasant thing that never reached his eyes. He was the king's regent, his late wife's uncle, the most trusted man in the kingdom. His scent was dry and papery, like old books, but underneath it, Ilara detected something else, something cloying and false. "Theron," he said smoothly, his eyes flicking to Ilara with dismissive curiosity. "We must discuss the trade agreements with the southern clans. Lady Seraphina's father grows impatient." He stopped, his gaze sharpening. "What is this? A servant?" "I am handling a staffing matter," Theron said, his tone clipped. At that moment, from down the hall, came the faint, familiar sound of Prince Cale crying.
The sound, as always, made Theron's shoulders tense. Lord Valerius sighed, a theatrical sound of paternal concern. The boy is difficult. The nurse does her best, of course, but he lacks a mother's touch. An idea, sudden and irrational, seized Theron. An impulse born from a single look in a crowded hall. He turned his gaze back to Ilara. "The head nurse is dismissed," he said, his voice ringing with absolute authority. The words hung in the air, stunning both Valerius and Ilara into silence. "What?" Valerius sputtered. "Theron, that is unwise. She has served the royal family for decades." Theron ignored him. His eyes were locked on Ilara. "You will take her place. You will attend the prince, effective immediately." The world tilted on its axis. Ilara could only stare, her mouth agape. Her? An Omega? A scullery maid? Attend the royal heir? It was impossible. It was madness. "Your Majesty, I have no training," she stammered. "You will learn," he stated, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "This is an outrage." Valerius's voice was sharp, his pleasant mask slipping to reveal the steel beneath. "She is an Omega, a nobody from the kitchens. The care of the royal heir is a position of honor and trust. It cannot be given to her." "It can." Theron's voice dropped to a low growl, the Alpha King emerging from the grieving man. "And it has been. My word is law, Valerius. Or have you forgotten?" The regent's face paled. He bowed his head stiffly. "Of course, Your Majesty. You are the king." The words were deferential, but his scent was a sudden spike of bitter resentment and something else, something that smelled like fear. "You are dismissed, Ilara," the king said, his tone softening almost imperceptibly. "Go to the nursery."
"Your duties begin now." Numb with shock, Ilara curtsied and fled the room, her mind reeling. She didn't see the look that passed between the king and his regent, a silent clash of wills that promised a storm to come. She had been claimed, in a way, pulled from the shadows and thrust into the very heart of the royal family's sorrow. She was terrified, but a tiny, forgotten spark of purpose flickered within her. The king had seen her, and for the first time in her life she felt as though she might not be a ghost after all. Ilara was moved from the cramped servants' dormitory to a small Spartan chamber adjoining the royal nursery. It was a cage, albeit a slightly more comfortable one. The other servants now looked at her with a mixture of awe and suspicion. She was no longer one of them. Bryn was the only one who dared to speak to her, pressing a small hand-carved wooden bird into her palm for luck. "The king is a wounded wolf, child," the old woman had warned. "They are the most dangerous kind." The nursery was a room drowning in silent opulence. A finely carved cradle, silk hangings, toys the infant prince never touched. But as Ilara stepped inside for the first time as its keeper, her unique senses were assaulted by an overwhelming nothing. It was the most disturbing scent she had ever encountered. The room smelled of lavender soap, clean linen, and lemon oil used to polish the wood. But the baby, Prince Cale, had no scent of his own. Every living creature had a scent, a unique signature of their life force. Wolfkin especially had powerful scents tied to their rank, their emotions, their very soul. An alpha's scent was earthy and commanding, an omega's was softer, like chamomile and rain. A baby's should be the most potent of all, a sweet, milky, unmistakable smell of new life and pure bloodline. Prince Cale smelled of nothing. It was a void, a blank space where a soul's scent should be. It was profoundly, fundamentally wrong. It was like looking at a person with no face. This, she realized with a dawning horror, was the heart of the problem. How could a father bond with a son who had no scent? The primal connection, the very foundation of their kind, was missing its most crucial component. Her days fell into a quiet routine. She cared for the prince with a gentle efficiency that soothed the perpetually fretful child. She bathed him, fed him, hummed soft, forgotten lullabies her own mother had once sung to her. The baby, who had been stiff and unresponsive with the previous nurse, began to relax in her arms. He would even sleep, his small body curled against hers. The king began to visit. At first, he would stand in the doorway, a dark, looming figure, his face an unreadable mask. He said he was observing, ensuring she was competent. But Ilara knew it was more than that. He was drawn to the room, to the sun he could not reach, and perhaps to the strange Omega who seemed to quiet the storm in both of them. One night he found her sitting in the rocking chair by the fire, the sleeping prince nestled in her arms. The room was quiet, save for the crackling flames and the soft rhythm of the chair. He didn't announce himself, simply watched from the shadows. "He sleeps for you," he said, his voice soft. It startled her. "He's just a baby, Your Majesty. He needs warmth," she replied, not looking up. Theron stepped into the light. The firelight played across the harsh planes of his face, softening them. The scent of his grief was a constant, dull ache in the air. "I have held him," he confessed, the words torn from him. "Twice. The day he was born and the day his mother was buried. I felt nothing." His voice cracked on the last word. "It is as if he is a stranger's child. The blood in my veins does not recognize him. The priests say my grief has broken me. The council says I am cursed. What kind of Alpha King cannot recognize his own son? I am a monster." The confession was raw, stripped of all royal pride. It was the howl of a wounded man. Ilara's heart ached for him. She finally looked at him, her gaze direct and compassionate. "You are not a monster, Your Majesty. You are a father who cannot find his son. It is not your fault." "Then whose is it?" he asked, his voice rough with despair. "I don't know," she admitted. "But something is wrong. Not with you and not with him." She held his gaze, a silent promise passing between them. She knew with the certainty of her strange gift that the answer lay in that terrifying, scentless void surrounding the prince, and she would find it. This quiet confession became a turning point. The king's visits grew longer, his demeanor less guarded. He began to speak to her, not as a king to a servant, but as a man burdened by an impossible weight. He spoke of his late wife, Lyra, of their brief happiness, of the crushing guilt that he had somehow failed her. Ilara listened, offering no easy platitudes, only the quiet comfort of her presence. She, in turn, began her secret investigation. Every item that came into the nursery was subjected to her intense scrutiny. The goat's milk, the water from the well, the herbs used in his bath. She found nothing amiss. The scentless void clung only to the prince himself, and most powerfully to his clothing. The fine linen shirts, the soft wool blankets, they were all steeped in that unnatural nothingness. One afternoon, Lady Seraphina swept into the nursery unannounced, her crimson gown a jarring intrusion in the quiet room. Her scent, a mix of sharp florals and ambition, made Ilara's nose wrinkle. "So this is the new nursemaid," Seraphina said, her voice dripping with condescension as she circled Ilara. "The little Omega mouse the king has taken a fancy to. Tell me, do you have any skills beyond changing diapers?" Ilara stood, placing herself protectively between the noblewoman and the prince's cradle. "My only concern is for the prince's well-being, my lady." Seraphina laughed, a sharp, unpleasant sound. His well-being would be best served by a strong mother, a true alpha queen, not a servant playing at being a nurse. When I am queen, you will be the first to be sent back to the kitchens where you belong."
"That will be enough, Seraphina."
The king's voice cut through the air like a whip. He stood in the doorway, his face thunderous. Seraphina started, her arrogant composure faltering. "Theron, You were just leaving," he finished for her, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Elara is here by my command. You will treat her with respect, or you will not enter these chambers again." Humiliation and fury warred on Seraphina's face. She shot Elara a look of pure venom before sweeping out of the room. The king's gaze softened as he looked at Elara. He stepped closer, his presence filling the room. "Are you all right?" "I am, Your Majesty." He noticed the threadbare shawl around her shoulders. The nursery, for all its fine things, was draughty. Without a word, he unclasped the heavy fur-lined cloak he wore and draped it over her. It was heavy and warm, and it smelled of him, of pine and winter air, and a strength that belied his inner turmoil. The gesture was so unexpected, so intimate, that it stole her breath. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching the warm fur. "It is I who should be thanking you," he said, his voice low. "The castle has been quieter since you came. The boy cries less, and so it seems do I." His gaze dropped to her lips for a fraction of a second before he turned and left, leaving her wrapped in his scent and the startling warmth of his kindness. The cloak became her shield. She wore it constantly. His scent was a comfort, a tangible sign of his growing trust. The bond between them was deepening, shifting from a strange alliance into something more fragile, more hopeful. One evening, long after the castle had fallen silent, Elara was examining one of the prince's new tunics. It had been delivered that day, a gift from Lord Valerius, he had said, from his own household looms. The material was exquisitely soft, but it reeked of that familiar, disturbing void. She held it to her nose, concentrating, trying to push past the blankness to find what lay beneath. There was something, a faint, dusty, bitter undertone,
almost undetectable shadow root. The name surfaced from a half-forgotten lesson with an old village herbalist, a rare, dangerous herb. It was said to muffle the senses, to create confusion. But to do this, to erase a scent so completely, it must have been treated with some kind of magic. She was so engrossed that she didn't hear the king enter. He moved with a predator's silence. He watched her for a long moment, her brow furrowed in concentration, his cloak around her shoulders. "What have you found?" he asked, his voice startling her from her reverie. She jumped, clutching the small tunic. "Your Majesty, I think I know what's wrong." She spoke in a rush, the words tumbling out. "It's his clothes, all of them. There is something in the fabric. An herb, I think. It's hiding him. His scent is muffled. It's like trying to hear a whisper through a stone wall." He looked at her, his expression one of intense skepticism. An herb in the clothing?
It sounded like the fantasy of a superstitious peasant, and yet he trusted her. His instincts, long dormant, screamed at him to listen. He had seen the way the prince calmed in her arms. He had felt the peace she brought to his own tormented spirit. He reached out, intending to take the tunic. Instead, his fingers brushed against hers. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot up his arm. It was not magic. It was something far more potent, a connection, a spark in the darkness. Her eyes widened, her breath catching. In that moment, the Alpha King and the Omega Maid were just a man and a woman, standing on the precipice of a terrifying and beautiful possibility. "Show me," he said, his voice husky. The skepticism was gone, replaced by a desperate, burgeoning hope. He believed her, and in his belief the world began to shift. The plan was simple and terrifying in its audacity. Ilara took one of the prince's plainest sleeping gowns, one that had been in storage and had not come from Valerius's seemingly endless supply of gifts. She scrubbed it herself with harsh lye soap and rinsed it 3 times in fresh snowmelt, hanging it to dry before the nursery fire until it smelled only of clean linen and wood smoke. That night, after his bath, she dressed Prince Cale in the simple, clean gown. Theron stood in the shadows of the doorway, a silent, anxious sentinel. For the first few minutes nothing happened. The child was quiet in his cradle, and the air held the same frustrating neutrality. Ilara's heart began to sink. Had she been wrong? Had she imagined it all? Then it began. A subtle shift in the air. A faint, tentative fragrance, like fresh cream and summer wildflowers. It was delicate, almost imperceptible, but it was there. It was the scent of a wolf pup. It was the scent of his son. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. She looked toward the doorway. Theron had taken a step into the room, his head tilted, his nostrils flared, his grey eyes, usually so stormy, were wide with disbelief. The scent grew stronger, weaving through the air, finding its way to him. It was the scent of his blood, his lineage, the unmistakable signature of Lyra's child and his own. Cale, he breathed, the name a prayer on his lips. He moved toward the cradle, his steps slow, almost fearful, as if approaching a mythical creature. He reached down and gathered his son into his arms. The moment the prince's body settled against his father's chest, the bond slammed into place. It was a physical, violent force of nature, a dam of grief and confusion breaking apart to release a flood of pure, primal love. A guttural growl ripped from Theron's chest, a sound of absolute possession, of a father finally claiming his own. He buried his face in the baby's neck, inhaling the scent of his son, the scent he had been denied for a year. Tears streamed down the king's face, tracing paths through the stoic mask he had worn for so long. The prince, feeling the security of the bond for the first time in his short life, didn't cry. He cooed, a soft, happy sound, and his tiny hand reached up to grasp his father's tunic. Ilara watched, her own tears blurring her vision. It was the most beautiful, heartbreaking thing she had ever witnessed. The broken king was being made whole, right before her eyes. But their victory was short-lived. A change so monumental could not go unnoticed. Lord Valerius, with his web of spies and informants, knew something had shifted the very next day. The king spent the entire morning with the prince, forgoing a council meeting for the first time in his reign. The laughter heard from the nursery, the king's deep baritone, and the baby's delighted gurgles was a death knell to Valerius's plans. He moved swiftly. That afternoon, as Theron was finally meeting with his council, his face transformed by a joy no one had seen before, Valerius made his gambit. He entered the nursery, flanked by 2 of his personal guards. Daxon, the loyal beta of the king's guard, moved to intercept him, but Valerius held up a hand. "I am here on a grave matter concerning the safety of the prince," he announced, his voice ringing with false sincerity. His eyes found Ilara, and they were cold and hard as chips of flint. "What is the meaning of this?" Ilara asked, her heart beginning to pound with dread. "The meaning," Valerius said, his voice carrying to the servants who had gathered in the hall, "is that we have found the source of the prince's affliction. It is witchcraft." He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at Ilara. "This Omega has enchanted the prince. She has used her dark arts to poison the king's mind against his most loyal advisers and cloud his judgment. She is a witch, and she must be stopped. Panic erupted. A servant, a young girl whose family worked Valerius's estates, was pushed forward. She was weeping, her scent a miasma of terror. She made me bring her strange herbs from the woods," the girl sobbed. "She chanted over the prince's cradle in a strange tongue." It was a lie, a well-rehearsed performance, but in the superstitious atmosphere of the court, it was damning. Lady Seraphina appeared at Valerius's side, her face a mask of triumph. "I warned the king she was not to be trusted," she declared. "She must be arrested before she does irreparable harm to the heir." Daxon looked uncertain, his hand on the hilt of his sword. He looked from the weeping servant girl to Ilara's pale, shocked face. He had seen the change in the king. He had heard the joy in his voice, but the accusation of witchcraft was a serious one. "Seize her!" Valerius commanded his guards. They moved forward. Ilara stood her ground, her mind racing. This was his plan: to discredit her, to remove her, to plunge the king back into his despair and regain control. She would not let him. "No," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the rising panic. "You will not." The authority in her tone, coming from a low-born Omega, was so startling it made the guards hesitate. She was no longer a frightened maid. She was a woman fighting for the man she had come to love and for the child she had saved. The confrontation had begun. The great hall was a theatre of judgment. Ilara stood in the centre, her hands bound in iron chains, the cold metal biting into her wrists. The lords and ladies of the court lined the walls, their faces a mixture of fear, morbid curiosity, and contempt. Lord Valerius stood before the ironwood throne, laying out his case with practised, solemn gravity. He presented the coerced servant's testimony, the strange herbs, which were nothing more than common lavender and mint from the kitchens, and Lady Seraphina's venomous account of Ilara's unnatural influence. It was a tapestry woven from lies, but it was strong and convincing. King Theron sat on his throne, his face a granite mask. The joy of the morning had been replaced by a cold, terrible fury. He held Prince Cale in his arms, a public declaration of the bond that had been forged. The baby was calm, nestled against his father's chest, oblivious to the drama swirling around him. Theron's gaze never left Ilara. He was being tested. His entire court, his most trusted adviser, was telling him that the woman who had given him back his son was a witch who meant to destroy them all. His mind warred with his heart, his logic with the primal instinct that screamed her innocence. "The evidence is clear, Your Majesty," Valerius concluded, his voice resonating with false sorrow. "For the safety of the prince and the stability of the kingdom, this Omega witch must be purged with fire. I beg you, give the order for her execution." A murmur of agreement rippled through the court. Ilara's blood ran cold. She could feel the tide of fear and superstition turning against her. She looked at Theron, her eyes pleading with him to see the truth. He was the king. He was her only hope. But he was also a man besieged by doubt and years of manipulation. She knew in that moment she could not rely on his heart alone. She had to give him proof, something undeniable that would shatter Valerius's web of deceit. She had one chance, one gamble that would mean either her life or her death. She straightened her shoulders, lifting her chin. The chains rattled, the sound echoing in the tense silence. "I am not a witch," she said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "I am a servant who uncovered a great crime, a betrayal that sits in this very room." She turned her gaze on Valerius, who flinched almost imperceptibly. "You want proof? I will give you proof. The truth has a scent, your majesty, and so does deceit." She laid out her desperate plan. "Let the king hold his son, dressed in the simple clothes I provided, the clothes he wears now. Let everyone witness the bond. Then dress the prince in a tunic provided by Lord Valerius. Let the court see what happens. The truth will be known." It was an insane proposal, a trial based on something as ephemeral as scent. Valerius laughed, a short, sharp bark of ridicule. "Absurd! The ramblings of a condemned witch trying to save her own skin. Your Majesty, do not indulge this fantasy." But Theron was listening. He looked down at the child in his arms, felt the warmth, smelled the sweet, milky scent that was now the most precious thing in the world to him. He remembered the void. He remembered the years of empty, aching silence. "I support the request," a gruff voice called out. It was Daxon, the beta of his guard. He stepped forward, his hand on his sword, his gaze steady. "I have seen the king's grief, and I have seen his joy. This is a small price to pay for absolute certainty." The beta's support was a crucial weight on the scales. Theron looked at Ilara, a silent question in his eyes. She met his gaze without flinching, her own eyes conveying a single, powerful message. "Trust me." "So be it," the king commanded, his voice like rolling thunder. "Bring the tunic." A servant scurried away and returned with one of the finely embroidered tunics from the nursery, a gift from Valerius. The air in the hall was thick with anticipation. First, Theron held Kyle aloft for a moment. He buried his face in his son's neck, a possessive, loving gesture. A low, contented rumble started in his chest, the sound of a happy alpha. The bond was visible to all, a palpable aura of paternal love and protection. Then, with gentle hands, he allowed a nurse to remove the simple gown and dress the prince in Valerius's tunic. The effect was immediate and horrifying. The moment the fabric settled on the child's skin, the scent vanished. It was not a fading, but a snuffing out, as if a candle had been extinguished. The sweet, milky fragrance was gone, replaced by that sickening, unnatural void. The prince, who had been content, began to fuss, his connection to his father severed. In Theron's arms, the world shifted back to the cold, grey emptiness of before. The bond was gone, the warmth, the love, the recognition erased. A strangled cry of pure agony escaped the king's lips. He looked at the child in his arms, and once again he was a stranger. The change in the king was terrifying to behold. The radiant joy drained from his face, replaced by a storm of disbelief, then rage, then a cold, murderous fury. He ripped the cursed tunic from his son's body as if it were on fire. The moment the prince's bare skin met his father's again, the scent and the bond rushed back, flooding the king's senses. He held his son tight, his knuckles white. He lifted his head, and his eyes, now the colour of a winter storm at its peak, found Lord Valerius. The entire court held its breath. "What?" Theron snarled, each word a drop of venom. "Have you done?" Valerius's face was a mask of chalky white terror. His plan had crumbled into dust, exposed, trapped, his composure finally shattered. "He was never meant to be your heir," he shrieked, his voice thin and reedy with panic. "He was supposed to be mine to control. You were weak, drowning in your grief for my foolish niece. The kingdom needed a strong hand. My hand! With the bond severed, the council would have declared you unfit. I would have ruled as regent, as is my right." The confession, born of pure desperation, sealed his fate. He made a move to flee, but Daxon was faster. The baiter's sword was at his throat before he had taken 2 steps. The guards loyal to the king closed in, their spears levelled. The trusted betrayer was caught. The truth was out, not because of a confession, but because of a scent only a desperate father and a gifted Omega could recognize. In the ensuing chaos, Ilara was forgotten. But Theron never took his eyes off her. He had trusted her, and she had saved them all. In the quiet aftermath, the great hall was cleared of all but the most loyal guards. Lord Valerius and his co-conspirators, including a weeping Lady Seraphina, were dragged to the dungeons to await the king's justice. Ilara's chains were struck off by a humbled and apologetic Daxon. She rubbed her raw wrists, her body trembling with exhaustion and the fading adrenaline of her ordeal. Theron, still holding his son, walked toward her. He did not stop until he was standing directly in front of her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He looked down at her, his expression one of overwhelming gratitude, of awe, of a love so profound it needed no words. He had been a man living in a black and white world, and she had shown him color. He had been a king ruling a silent kingdom, and she had given him back its music. "You gave me back my son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave me back my soul." He shifted Kyle into one arm and reached out with his free hand, gently cupping her cheek. His touch was warm and sure. "Forgive me," he whispered, "for my doubt, for ever letting them harm you." "There is nothing to forgive," she replied, her voice soft. He nursed her himself through the following days. He dismissed the servants bringing her meals, tending to the cuts on her wrists, sitting by her bedside as she recovered from the shock. He told her everything about his plans for the kingdom, his fears, his dreams. And she, in turn, told him of her lonely life, of the strange gift of scent she had always thought a curse. He listened, not with pity, but with reverence. "It is not a curse," he told her, his hand covering hers. "It is the magic that saved our line, the magic that saved me." 3 days after the trial, he led her to the throne room. The court was assembled, their faces a mixture of apprehension and respect. Theron, with Prince Kael secure in a sling against his chest, stood before them all. "You bore witness to a great betrayal," he announced, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "And you bore witness to an even greater truth. This woman, Ilara, whom my former regent maligned as a witch, is a hero of this kingdom. Her unique gifts uncovered a treason that would have shattered the foundations of this throne." He turned to face her, taking both of her hands in his. "But she is more than that. She is the other half of my soul, the mate I thought I would never find." He went down on one knee before her, the Alpha King kneeling to the Omega Maid. The entire court gasped. "Ilara, you have healed my family. You have healed my heart. Be my queen." Tears streamed down her face as she nodded, unable to speak. "Yes," she finally whispered. "Yes." The union ceremony was not one of pomp and circumstance, but one of deep, primal significance. It was held under the open sky, at the foot of the Frostfang Peaks. Theron and Ilara stood before the heart tree of his ancestors, and in the presence of the entire kingdom, he marked her as his mate, his scent mingling with hers, creating a new, powerful fragrance of unity and strength. The Omega from the kitchens was now their queen, not by birth or by conquest, but by a courage and love that had proven stronger than any poison. 6 months later, Queen Ilara stood on the high balcony of the palace, looking out over the capital city. The chill of the north was still there, but it no longer felt hostile. It felt like home. Strong arms wrapped around her from behind, and she leaned back into the solid warmth of her husband's chest. King Theron rested his chin on her shoulder. In her arms she held Prince Cale, who was no longer a quiet, listless baby, but a giggling, happy child who reached for his father with chubby hands. The bond between father and son was a beautiful, tangible thing, a constant source of joy that had healed the last of the king's old wounds. Theron was no longer the broken ruler of a grieving court. He was a loving father, a devoted mate, and a king whose wisdom was now tempered with a compassion he had learned from his queen. "He has your eyes," Theron murmured, his lips brushing her temple. "And your stubbornness," she laughed, as Kyle tugged insistently on a lock of her hair. He turned her in his arms, his grey eyes soft with a love that still took her breath away. "I lived in silence for so long," he said, his voice low and earnest. "A world without scent, without connection. I never knew what my world was missing until I smelled the truth in you." She smiled, her heart full. "And I never knew my gift had a purpose until I found you." He lowered his head and kissed her, a deep, lingering kiss that spoke of promises kept and a future secured. Below them, the kingdom thrived, safe under the rule of a king and queen brought together by a hidden power. Theirs was a family forged not by convenience or politics, but by a bond that had proven stronger than any curse, a love that had unmasked the deepest of betrayals and healed the most broken of hearts.